Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Wu Says. This is where we get serious and get real about the US, China, and everywhere and everything in between. It's two superpowers, one global story. This week, we're going to travel back in time a little bit, a couple of decades. More than a couple, 1997 to be exact, the Asian financial crisis of 1997-1998. I don't know whether you remember it, but it brought down governments, it weakened currencies, and it changed Southeast Asia forever, even the world, I would say, maybe. And it sparked sweeping reforms around the countries in the region, Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia. It widened the economic and political rift that shaped Malaysia, that still shapes Malaysia today, I would argue. And the question is, what really happened during that crisis? And what can today's leaders learn from that moment in time? So I'm Melisa Idris. Join me on the show, and with me to unpack this is Professor Thye, who during the height of the crisis served as the Special Economic Advisor to U.S. Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, who in 1997 was under the Clinton administration. Prof. Wu, let's rewind time a little bit. We'll go to the very start of before it even became a crisis. Take us back to 1997. What would you say with the lens of the 2020 lens and goggles of hindsight, what would you say triggered the Asian financial crisis?
Well, at the time when it happened, there were a number of competing explanations. The word that was most commonly heard in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. was that crony capitalism brought Southeast Asia down. Basically, there was so much corruption, and the corruption led to wrong investments. That meant that these countries were making products that ultimately failed to meet the market test. So because of crony capitalism, these economies collapsed. That was the common explanation. But with hindsight, I would describe these three main competing explanations this way. Think of an island where a huge typhoon, hurricane, tornado has swept through, and at the end of it, there are all these bodies lying on the beach. So the question is, what did they die from? And you'll find three classes of deaths. The goal is, which class was the dominant class of death? For example, some people died because they were in very bad health. They were suffering from obesity and had that very weak heart. And when the heavy winds blow, they got scared, they got a heart attack, and they died. So that is bad health is responsible for the death. In other words, even if a branch had fallen off a tree and found their head, it would have scared them, and they would have a heart failure, and they would have died in any case. The second one would be the coconut tree fell on them. He was running away. He was in perfectly good health, but the tree fell on him. So that is just bad luck. And the third one would be the ambulance came and said, come, we'll take you away faster. They went onto the ambulance, but the ambulance, instead of giving them oxygen, gave them nitrogen. And so they died. So that is bad doctoring. So these are the three explanations. One is bad health. In other words, these economies had done so many wrong economic policies that they basically had it coming. They deserved what they got. Crony capitalism. The second explanation would be that financial markets are vulnerable to boosts of over-optimism and periods of over pessimism. So when you think of financial speculative bubbles, which means that the price goes up because people are very gung-ho about the future, which turns out to be wrong. And when they are, so you have got a bubble, but once they realized they were optimistic, they became over pessimistic. And you got a big crash. So that would be panics and panic and crashes. So that would be market panic, would be the second explanation. In other words, smart money felt scared and they ran. And because all of them ran collectively, so much money was pulled out that the economies collapsed. Because you must understand that since the beginning of the 1990s, East Asia, especially ASEAN, had very good press because of the success of the tiger economies, Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan. In the 1980s, people were expecting this to be the time of the rise of Southeast Asia. So if you remember, there were lots of books written about the Pacific century. Wow. And the economists even had a picture of a dragons flying the air, snorting fire, and with the subtitle, Asia Unleashed. This was 1993. And the same year, 1993, the World Bank published a report called the East Asian Miracle. In other words, ASEAN will soon join the tigers of the 1980s. So if you were an investor, especially an institutional investor, who cannot tell the difference between Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, they are just little blobs on the map. When you hear all of this positive press, money just flowed into the region. In fact, the money that flowed in the region was so overwhelming that the growth rate of Malaysia from 1990 to 1997 was almost 9% a year. And the lowest growth rate in the 1990 to 97 period, the lowest growth rate in that year was 7.7. The average was 9 and the lowest was 7.7. You could see there was certainly good times in that time. When you have such exuberance, that is and people put more and more money into Southeast Asia, they also get more and more nervous. And if for some reason, Mr. A sees Mr. B taking money out, Mr. A must say, Mr. B must know something I don't know. To be careful, I will take my money out too. And Mr. C, who sees them, say they must know something I don't know. So they all took their money out. In fact, if you look at the outflow of money during the financial crisis was prompted by an outflow of funds. And that was mostly funds that were called back by the banks, especially Japanese banks, because interest rate in Japan was zero. Since interest rate in Japan was zero, and the exchange rates of most of Southeast Asian countries have been very stable since 1984. Like, for example, the Thai baht stayed in the range of 24 baht per dollar, 24 to 26 baht per dollar from 1984 up to 1996. So given that stability and the zero interest rate in Thailand, you would certainly borrow money from zero interest rate in Japan. Sorry, I misspoke. So you borrow money from Japan, the money floated in, the economies boomed. And when the Japanese bankers panicked, they pulled the money out. Well, the exchange rate collapsed. So that's the second one. So there was a panic. But what made the panic really severe was that the IMF came along and said, these countries have been badly mismanaged. That's why they have this collapse in their markets. And the moment the IMF said that these countries were badly managed, it's almost like someone shouting fire in a crowded theater. Everybody rushed for the entrance. So what happened? You could say the IMF converted a small panic to a large-scale panic. So of these three explanations, one was bad health. It is true there was crony capitalism in all these countries. There was corruption. It's also true that there was definitely a panic by the banks. They took their money out. And the third is the IMF made things worse.
Wow.
So
Okay.
what?
All right, so I'm just going to jump in here and get you to elaborate on some of the things. What caused the banks to panic? And why did IMF say that these countries are badly managed? What was the reason for them making that justification and causing even more panic, making the crisis spread?
Well, this comes from two. Let's talk about the IMF attitude. The 1980s was a time that the prevailing economic paradigm, the model that the IMF uses to think about the world, is based on what we call the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus is basically says has three components. One is free market is good for you and me and for everybody. And so if there's bad economic performance, it is bad economic policy of suppressing the market. So we need to have the market work. And second, we got to keep a tight budget so that you don't print money to finance government deficit. So that is macroeconomic orthodoxy. The third one is the belief that of all the markets that are in existence, the most efficient markets are the financial markets because of the oil. Do you know why people make so much money in the financial markets? Because they're really smart people. Because they are so smart, that's why they're making so much money. And because they are smart, we know that if there is anything wrong, they would quickly correct it. So that was first this belief in the very strong belief in the invisible hand, that the market is the right mechanism to allocate money. And the second thing is the financial markets is the best of the bunch of markets. You could see it in the economics literature. There is the efficient markets hypothesis, which basically say you cannot make money on Wall Street because Wall Street is full of smart people. The moment a money opportunity appears, someone will take advantage of it and it disappears. This is, of course, a big sell by Wall Street in order to persuade the government not to regulate them. So Wall Street financed lots of economics research, especially at the National Bureau of Economic Research, to sing the praise of financial markets. And that was, of course, the time of Alan Greenspan, who was a believer in this. Now, this belief that the IMF had, they thought was completely verified by what they were doing in the 1990 period onwards. Because the 1990 was when the centrally planned economies switched to market economies. And the reason they switched was because central planning doesn't work and the market was the solution. So it simply reinforced the Milton Friedman view of economics, that if there's a bad economic outcome, look no further than your government. And your government has to stand aside and let the market work. That in general is not bad policy, but the only thing that it forgets is that financial markets are vulnerable to occasional periods of over-optimism and over-pessimism. And when this kind of periods appear, the government has a role to play, a very important role. And the refusal to recognize this can be seen in that Alan Greenspan coined the term irrational exuberance to describe the booming markets of the US in the 1990s. Note, he used the word irrational exuberance, but he said it, but he didn't do anything about it because basically he didn't believe in it. He was thinking of it as an academic possibility, but seriously, it could not be true. Now, that particular attitude background, which IMF comes, which was they were rebuilding the Eastern European economies. As we had said in a previous episode, the Russian and the Polish economies had too many heavy industries. They invested in the wrong stuff. And because they invested in the wrong stuff, what happens is you got to move the workers away from the wrong occupations to what the country has competitive advantage in. Now, moving people takes time, which means that the recovery will only occur after a couple of years. So, if you want to talk about a mental picture of how GNP is like, GNP would follow a U shape. It is a certain level right at the end of the central planning period, but that was unsustainable because they were just producing lots of iron that were not being put to use. So once you stop producing iron, the GDP collapsed. Then people start moving to the other industries. They now make a dishwasher, clothes, shoes, toys, and then output goes up. So you have a U shape. That is what happens if it is explanation number one, that it was bad health. If you died because of bad health, then to prevent yourself from dying, the bad health fellows should start building up their body to be resistant again. Now, what if it were a panic? What a panic would be is that when a panic happens, the banks are not lending out money because they are scared. And when the banks don't lend out money, business cannot produce because they need working capital to buy inputs. So the output will immediately collapse. But once the panic is over, when the banks realize they were being silly, being so cautious, and money flows again, output just jumps back up. So if it is a panic, the GNP path is a V shape instead of a U shape. A U shape where you drag out over time before recovery. A V shape is there was a panic, things drop, and after you pull yourself together, you produce exactly the same thing as you used to produce before. Only that this time you get the working capital from the banks to do it. If you look at the recovery path of Malaysia, Thailand, and Korea, what you see is a big V. There was no U. In fact, if you look at the IMF reports of the period, they predicted that recovery will not come for 3 years, at least 2 years. And our recovery came just the next year after the collapse. 98, we hit bottom. 99, we were growing like nobody's business. So, in retrospect, it was quite clear that it was a panic. And what the IMF recommendation make the panic worse. Because the IMF saw the banks as having lent to all the wrong industries in the first place. So what did the IMF do? they closed all the banks. In other words, these were the culprits that caused the collapse. It's true, because they panicked, they caused the collapse. But then to close them, that means that they cannot resume operation when the panic is over. So the IMF action just made it a lot worse. The IMF now admits that it had failed to take into account the phenomena of speculative bubbles and financial crashes, financial panics.
Wow.
That is why the economics profession in most parts of the world, except possibly in the United Kingdom and the United States, began to have a much more cautious view towards economic management after the crisis. But the important development was after the 2008 global financial crisis, when Lehman Brothers went splat on the ground and melted the world, the Americans now are also aware that financial markets could misbehave. And when they do misbehave, the consequences are exceedingly serious.
Can we talk about that? Sorry, did you want to finish your thought?
Well, one thing I like to say is when you look at the collapse in 2008 in the United States, which was foreshadowed by the 1997-98 Asian financial crisis, when it happened in Asia, they all said, it's crony capitalism. There was an instinctive reaction. Basically, it's like if bad things happen to you, you must have sinned because you got what's coming to you. But when it happened to themselves, they recognized the financial markets could misbehave. And when financial markets could misbehave, the right solution is to undertake reforms, especially putting in of regulations. But in the case of the United States, in the 2008 financial crisis, there have been no reforms. The reason is because, unlike the 1929 crisis, in the 1929 crisis, all the big banks went bankrupt. A lot of big financiers committed suicide by jumping off. There's this horrible account of someone walking out of Wall Street at night and all his bodies splatting down from the upper floors.
Oh no.
But in 2008, no such thing happened. Basically, the governments realized to make a quick recovery, the banks have to be saved. And they saved all the bankers along with the banks. The trouble with they should have let the banks go back. They should have saved the banks, but not the bankers. Like Goldman Sachs was in financial trouble. It was Treasury that saved Goldman Sachs and all the financial houses. Because they survived, they are able to resist any regulation of their activities. And now that they have bankrolled the election of Donald Trump, he is removing whatever puny regulations that have been put in after 2008. So the lesson of the Asian financial crisis is clear, but what have we done about it in the US? Unfortunately, nothing, because Wall Street, because we bail out the bankers, unlike 1929, and the bankers are alive to resist any reform.
So, I mean, that's a really kind of bitter pill to swallow, the fact that the lessons of the Asian financial crisis we haven't actually acted enough on them in the US. And I want to ask you about here in the region. So talk to me about the consequences of the AFC in Asia. What happened in Asia that in hindsight now you see, did we learn the lessons here in this region?
Okay. Two sets of lessons. One is on the economic side, and the other side, big change or in the region is on the political side. Let us start with the economic side first. One thing we do know is that in a time of trouble, the only reliable source of help is self-help. In other words, no one's going to come bail you up unless you are an important political ally of a big power. For example, if that's why Suharto, when Indonesia got into trouble, Suharto expected the Americans to mobilize Japan and the IMF to bail out the Indonesian banks and saved him. Because that would not be the first time that Suharto was bailed out by the Americans. The Americans bailed him out in 1966. They bailed him out during the Pertamina crisis of the 1970s. And they bailed him out in the 1980s when there was a global slowdown. So Suharto knew that the US had his back. But what he did not realize was that 1997 was no longer 1983 or 1966. It's because the Cold War was over. They no longer needed Indonesia to be a staunch ally against the communists. That is number one. And number two, Suharto was very old. He was by about 80 years old. And so the Americans could see that his days were numbered. So they would rather support his successor than to delay the political transition. So they told Suharto, well, we are not going to bail you out this time. And when he heard this, Suharto said, if that is true, I'll be gone in 3 months. And he was right. He was gone in 3 months. So, in other words, if the global geopolitical situation changed for a big important country like Indonesia, that changed the end of the Soviet Union and of competing ideology, meant that the US don't have to spend money to bail out its friends because there's no Soviet Union who's going to come and take over that friend. But what happened is the aftermath of this crisis is that every country started building up its foreign exchange reserves. They all want to increase their dollar holdings. But then they realized this is irrational. If we are able to pool our individual reserves and lend it to any one of us who's in trouble, then we don't have to each have to keep so much reserves, because keeping so much reserves is costly.
Yeah.
So we have started the Chiang Mai initiative, which is a pooling of foreign exchange reserves. But on this account, I'd like to tell you about the brilliant Japanese proposal in September 1997 that was made during the IMF meeting in Hong Kong.
Which you attended, Prof. Wu. You were
Yes.
with U.S. Treasury Secretary Reuben there in that meeting in Hong Kong with the IMF.
Yes, I was. I was the fly on the wall. Yeah, I was a small fly. Let's put it.
Tell us what the fly saw.
Well, I didn't see. It was reported to me. The Japanese proposed to set up an Asian monetary fund. Basically, the Japanese say, we will put in the money to bail out these Southeast Asian countries. And that the Japanese, when the Japanese said that, that basically makes the Americans feel quite insecure, because that meant that the United States, that the IMF would no longer be the monopoly policeman of the world. And the IMF is only 3 blocks away from the US Treasury. And the deputy of the IMF has always been an American. And in this case, it was Stanley Fischer at that time. And basically, the Americans control the policy of the IMF. And so the Americans could see that if an Asian Monetary Fund, it will no longer be able to have such a strong control over the economies, the other economies in the world. So it was it wasn't enthusiastic of the Japanese proposal, because saying that it could undermine the work of the IMF, it could lead to duplicative efforts. But the big mistake of the Japanese was that they had not done their homework. They did not raise this idea of the Asian Monetary Fund to China. So China was caught by surprise too, that this big proposal of forming an Asian Monetary Fund, and we, who are going to be the biggest boys in the block in the next 10 years, so China did not support the Asian Monetary Fund. So basically, the Asian Monetary Fund idea was killed. But in retrospect, we all know it's a mistake. The Chinese knows they should have supported it. But basically, what we have now in Singapore, what's that's called the Asian Monetary AMRO, Asian Monetary Research Office, I think. Asian Macroeconomic Research Office, AMRO. That is the embryo of what may become an Asian Monetary Fund in the future. So as Asia becomes more important, we have the money to set up our own fire station, whereas Africa cannot afford to set up its own fire station. That is basically what an Asian Monetary Fund is. And that is a lesson we have learned, and we are in the middle of building that up. But with the beginning of the Cold War, if there is a split in Asia, the coalition in Asia, then the Asian Monetary Fund may not come about after all.
Right. So I think we should leave it here for now and come back and zoom in on specific countries. I mean, the Asian financial crisis was so big and so layered to do it justice in just one episode. So let's come back and look at what happened in the different countries. Today we covered why it happened, what were some of the consequences that were felt around the world, and what lessons did we take from that or did not take from that. And we'll come back and zoom in on Malaysia, we'll zoom in on Indonesia, and also South Korea and Thailand. So that's it for this episode of Wu Says, where we get real about the US, China, and everywhere and everything in between. I'm Melisa Idris signing off. I will see you in the next one. Bye, folks.